ASEAN Secretariat and the East Asia Business Council as part of our efforts to promote and build awareness on RCEP agreement. The first session today will consist of 4 key presentations from the key speakers that will further elaborate the chapters in the RCEP agreement, which are competition, government procurement, government procurement, and small medium enterprises, as well as economic and technical cooperation. But before we begin, I would like to welcome our keynote speaker, Mrs. Sulaimah Mahmud, a Senior Director of ASEAN and Southeast Asia and Oceania Divisions at the Ministry of Trade and Industry, Singapore, to deliver an opening remark. Mrs. Sulaimah, you may have the screen.
Thank you, Percy. Good afternoon, distinguished speakers, guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be part of this RCEP webinars being organized and hosted by the ASEAN Secretariat in collaboration with the East Asia Business Council following the signing of the RCEP last November with its 5 ASEAN and also the 5 ASEAN FTA partners. I also like to thank both hosts for inviting me to share some of my remarks in this 5th and last series of webinars this year. And also I'd like to thank everyone of you there for joining us today in this webinar, which is to promote public awareness of the remaining chapters in the RCEP agreement. We will hear from the subject matters experts who will provide details on these chapters and how they can benefit businesses directly or to provide as enablers to facilitate the trade and investment in the region. It has been more than a year since COVID-19 ravaged the world. The signing of RCEP 2020 is a strong testament of the region's determination and commitment to deepening economic integration amidst difficult times. As the largest free trade area to date, the RCEP covers 30% of global GDP and 30% of the world population. In addition to traditional chapters and areas like goods, services, and investment, which they had earlier seminars touched on, the RCEP agreement is comprehensive, modern, and comprises 20 chapters and include new areas, such as the ones that we're covering today. And here, in the latest news we have is that, and the most welcome development to date is that the RCEP will enter into force for 10 RCEP participating countries: Australia, Brunei, Cambodia, Japan, China, Laos, New Zealand, and Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam on the 1st of January next year, which is valid 2 weeks from today, and Korea on the 1st of February next year. This achievement is another milestone and a clear commitment by the RCEP countries to push ahead and implement the RCEP agreement to support the post-COVID recovery efforts through providing more business opportunities, jobs, and overall economic growth in the region. We look forward to the timely entry into force for the RCEP for the remaining parties by early next year. With the entry into force, it is vital for companies to review the RCEP agreement and prepare themselves to use this agreement. The RCEP agreement spans over 14,000 pages. Why? Because it has 20 chapters and includes the commitments which are provided by the 15 parties and covering a wide array of topics. It is therefore important for businesses to familiarize themselves with the RCEP agreement in order to take advantage of the benefits of this agreement. And here I'd like to mention that, at least for Singapore, to share with you, we have conducted a series of outreach activities, virtual and even face-to-face or hybrid. And we are going to continue to do that next year. And we do hope to focus on some chapters and sectorals and businesses who have actually indicated to us that we are excited and happy and like to take advantage of this agreement. So here, let me take just briefly a few minutes to just discuss a bit on the chapters that we are covering today by the experts. Firstly, on the competition chapter. And here, I'm just delighted to have Mr. Teo Wee Guan, who has actually chaired the working group on competition policy during our 8 years of negotiations. This chapter is highly relevant to businesses. The RCEP countries are committed to maintaining competition law regimes based on international best practices and agreed principles. So businesses can look forward to RCEP countries cooperating on cross-border enforcement and relevant issues, including safeguards and on the protection of confidential information. This protects businesses from anti-competitive activities when operating in the RCEP markets. Secondly, on the chapter of micro and small, medium-sized enterprises, in short, Nsme's chapter. Throughout the negotiations process, all the 15, then 16 RCEP countries have been very firm that this agreement should benefit our micro SMEs, which make up majority of our companies. For example, in Singapore alone, our SMEs make up 99% of our enterprises. So we recognize that the MSMEs contribute greatly to economic growth, employment, and innovation. Thus, this chapter seeks to promote information sharing, cooperation, increasing SMEs' ability to utilize and benefit from the opportunities created by this agreement. Government procurement chapter. This is a new area, right? We do not have a government procurement agreement among the ASEAN 10 members, nor in any of the existing ASEAN +1 agreements. So RCEP countries are committed under RCEP to increasing transparency by publishing laws, regulations, and procedures regarding government procurement. As in all good agreements, and more importantly, the RCEP countries have also committed to review this chapter after entry into force, with a view to improve this chapter in the future. An economic and technical cooperation chapter. Some of you might ask, how relevant is this to the business, to companies? It may not seem immediately relevant to business, but here I'd like to mention that it does provide a valuable framework for realizing the development dimension of the agreement. The RCEP countries agreed that the economic and technical cooperation is important and aims to provide activities which help to narrow the development gaps and maximize mutual benefits among the parties. This will contribute greatly to the inclusive, effective, and efficient implementation and utilization of the agreement, especially in the long run. Thus, finally, I'd like to say that by signing the RCEP, what all of us have done is to build a road. Companies are like the cars that can potentially use this road that we've built across the 15 region. And given that most countries have already FTAs among themselves and each other, this is a good time for companies to review the benefits of all the agreements that we have established and agreed upon, and ensure that when RCEP comes into force, we are ready to take advantage of it. And we hope that through this session and the early ones, you would be able to see and find out more of which are some of the areas which are relevant to your companies, and so that you'll be equipped to take advantage of them. And I do hope that today's webinar will be interesting and enriching. And please, again, I'd like to reiterate that at any point in time, for companies, if you do have any questions and you need more face-to-face engagement, please do consult any of us in our respective national capitals, and even virtually. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibu Sulaima. Now, before we commence with the presentations, I would like to invite our speakers and panelists for a brief photo session. May I request our speakers and panelists to turn on their camera, please? All right, we'll say RCEP, yeah. So 1, 2, 3, RCEP. Again, 1, 2, 3, RCEP. Thank you very much, everyone. Now, Yeah, just a couple of house rules. All participants' camera and microphone have been disabled. This is to prevent unexpected noise and distraction. However, if you have any questions throughout the session, we have a Q&A box here where you can type your question. Later on, we will select some questions to be answered after the panel discussion. Now, without further ado, may I now give the screen to Mr. Theo Wee Guan, a Senior Director of the Competition and Consumer Commission of Singapore, to walk us through the overview of competition chapter under RCEP agreement. You may have the screen, Mr. Theo.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, let me thank ASEC for organizing this webinar and for inviting me to speak at this webinar. So I will go into the presentation proper. Can I just cover ASEC to load my slides, please? So some of you may find the competition chapter, a bit new because I think it's unlike other chapters. I think it was actually added into many FTAs at a later stage. So here is to give you an overview of what the competition chapter in FTAs, including RCEP, really does. Okay, next slide, please. So actually, we know that with globalization and internationalization, barriers to market access, to international trade and investment no longer just stop at the borders, like imposing tariffs. In fact, many of the barriers today, right, exist, within borders and across borders, and actually anti-competitive conduct by businesses is actually one such barriers. Which is what the competition chapter actually aims to do, is to ensure that players, businesses can actually compete on a level playing field. So that actually helps to facilitate trade and investment among RCEP parties, and also inject greater competition into markets, which will help to enhance economic efficiency and consumer welfare. So and also having a competition chapter, right, will ensure that parties who have competition law in place will apply them in a consistent manner based on international best practices and certain key principles. This will help to give businesses greater certainty, reduce their cost of compliance or transaction costs, and also it will also ensure that when it comes to enforcement of cross-border cases like merger of transnational companies, there will be a greater, more effective enforcement across jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So one of the key provisions that we have in the competition chapter is to ensure that RCEP parties actually maintain a competition law and also have authorities to actually implement the law. So actually, this is actually quite important, and I would say I'm glad to say that actually all 10 ASEAN countries now have competition laws in place. Although in terms of implementation, there will be transitional arrangements for countries such as Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. That's because they are pretty new, and hence the implementation of their competition laws, right, will take on a phasal approach. Yeah. Next slide, please. So basically, when I talk about anti-competitive activities, right, there are three main conduct. The first one is really about cartels, or what we call anti-competitive agreements, where competitors actually restrict or harm competition through anti-competitive agreements such as price fixing, bid rigging, market sharing, or limiting outputs. The second one is really about abuse of dominance, where we're talking about a big market player with substantial market power try to restrict competition from its competitors by engaging in certain anti-competitive conduct. And the third one is what I mentioned about mergers and acquisitions that substantially lessen competition within a market. So just to mention that the competition law actually applies to all entities engaged in commercial activities. So as far as you are engaged in economic commercial activities, you are actually covered, and that's regardless of ownership or nationality. And what I mean by ownership and nationality, it means that It doesn't matter whether you are privately owned or publicly owned, state-owned. It doesn't matter whether the company is a US company, a Chinese company, a Singapore company, or Malaysia company. It doesn't matter. So far as you operate and carry out commercial activities, you should be covered under the competition law. That said, I think the competition law of each country, right, will have certain exclusions and exemptions. That is inevitable, but the exclusions and exemptions, they should be made on transparent grounds and also based on public interest or public policy considerations. Yeah. Next slide, please. So this is just to elaborate a little bit about, what are some of the common conduct, associated with the first one that I mentioned, which is anti-competitive agreements, cartels. I think the common one, or most jurisdictions will actually consider as hardcore, would be the first four that I've listed on the slide: price fixing, bid rigging, output restriction, and market sharing. There are other softer forms of anti-competitive agreements, such as price recommendations, exchange of price information. This one, I think jurisdictions usually will take on a more effect-based kind of approach, not so much form-based compared to the earlier four that I mentioned about. And usually, they will actually look at whether the conduct itself, in totality, whether it generates, a net economic benefit for the economy. That said, right, I'm not saying that all kind of collaborations, between or among businesses are actually prohibited. That's not true. In fact, even for Singapore, we do allow certain form of collaborations, because we understand that certain collaborations between businesses are necessary, and in fact they are beneficial, for consumers and for the economy as a whole. But those kind of collaborations usually will come under the competition authority for some kind of net economic benefit kind of a test or assessment. Next slide, please. So I talk about the next one, which is really about abuse of dominance. And this one actually is quite important for SMEs and MSMEs. Reason being that this is usually where, a big player, a market leader, or a market player who has substantial, market power, engage in certain conduct, which makes it very difficult, especially for smaller players, to actually compete. They can do things like, signing up exclusivity agreements, with their suppliers, or if let's say they are a supplier of essential inputs right downstream, they actually refuse to supply to their competitors, through tying or bundling. They make sure that, the customer base is very much restricted, royalty rebates. Some of you may find it a bit funny, like, aren't some of these things actually beneficial for consumers? Yes, I would say that if they are, for example, royalty rebates, right? I mean, you get some kind of the rebates, in the first instance. As consumer, you should be very happy. But actually, competition authority, they take on a much longer term view, because some of these rebates given is just in the short term or in the interim. Then when the competitors are actually eradicated, right, what happens is that the dominant supplier or the monopoly will then raise prices to actually recover its cost. So this is something that quite typically we have seen in things like the ride-hailing market, where you can see that initially when they are trying to fight for market share, you see that there's very aggressive kind of incentives given out, rewards, royalty rebates, and what have you. But once the competitors, start to exit the market, and you're only left with one or two, then you see that, the scene completely changed. So I'm not saying that this conduct itself are per se, illegal. That's not correct, because I think competition authorities will take on, again, an effect-based approach. They will look at the conduct itself and assess whether there are objective justifications to the conduct, and whether in general the conduct as a whole generate net economic benefit for the economy, for consumers. Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay, the third one also is something quite important for SMEs and MSMEs, because this also concern about mergers, because certain mergers, right, involve big players, and you realize that some of the players are actually vertically integrated. So it's not so simple that it's just horizontally they are merging, because they can be merging with another player which is actually vertically integrated. And actually, once two players merge, right, sometimes it has impact on other businesses or competitors, especially where they are buying either upstream inputs or downstream, they're actually customer to the suppliers they're actually merging. So that's why some of these mergers, right, they do raise competition concerns as well, because some of these mergers, right, when they actually merge, right, certain businesses actually express concerns that, in terms of inputs upstream, they may be facing greater restriction or refusal of supply, or come downstream, when it comes to selling to their customer, they will realize that this customer no longer want to buy from them, but will buy from the suppliers, which they actually merge with it. So I think this is also something that will concern some of the businesses as well. Next slide, please. So talking about not just having the law, but ensuring that parties actually in implementing the law adhere to some due process. I think this is very important because we're talking about law enforcement here. So some of the things that we want the parties to abide or observe, in the implementation is that, decision making should be independent. Do not discriminate based on ownership, nationality, and like I mentioned earlier on, the rules, the regulations and laws, they must be made publicly available, they must be transparent. And more importantly, right, when there are decisions made, right, or sanctions imposed on the parties, right, the grounds must be transparent, made known, and also give the parties, the affected parties, a chance to make representations before you finalize your sanctions or penalties, and also give the party also an access to independent review or appeal to the decision. I think this is actually very important. Yeah. Next slide, please. So basically, under the competition chapter, we also provide certain types of cooperation among competition authorities, including notification. So let's say when Singapore look into a case, right, and think that Vietnam, Malaysia may be affected, Singapore Competition Authority, which CCCS, may actually contact VCC or PCC in Vietnam or Philippines to tell them that, hey, we're looking into this case. The second one is really about consultation, where if let's say I have a case here and I think Philippines is able to help me or Malaysia is able to help me, I can actually initiate a discussion with the competition authority overseas. The other one is really information exchange, which is like, for example, if both countries are looking into a similar case or a similar merger transaction, they can actually exchange information. And the last one is really coordination of enforcement activities. And these are things like, for example, you carry out dawn raids, which is quite common when you see in countries like Europe and all this, they will coordinate their dawn raids. Yeah. Next slide, please. There is also a portion on consumer protection, but the one I won't cover so much, but it's really about, prescribing misleading practices, false or misleading claims. Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think I'm just left with only one or two slides. I just want to say that, actually the competition chapters are not against businesses. Actually, they offer protection to businesses in the event that they actually encounter anti-competitive practices locally or overseas. So think of competition chapter like akin to a tournament. Okay, so what happened is that, I think all players in the tournament, they compete. And every player who actually take part in the tournament hopes to win. But what you want in taking part in a tournament is that you want all the players to play by the rules and the referee be objective and be neutral. And that's what actually the competition law does and competition authority do. Make sure that players play by the rule. Of course, in every game, there will always be stronger players who will win by merits. But what we don't want is where the players, right, they start bullying because their size is big, they think they can knock down another person, they can purposely injure the other person. Or, say in a court, you make your, like basketball, you make your net at your side lower, but you make the competitors one higher. So think of competition law as ensuring a level playing field where businesses can actually compete fairly, so that even the smaller players can stand a fair chance to actually succeed. So last slide is really about practical tips for businesses. Make sure that you have compliance programs in place. You are familiar with the do's and don'ts, in the competition law in the countries that you're operating in. And if you encounter anti-competitive activity, right, that restrict, entry or expansion, you should approach a competition authority to look into the matter, which I think to share with you in CCCS, we have cases like that where businesses actually come to us. I can quote an example, which is one is the Asia Pacific brewery, where certain businesses actually find it difficult to bring in certain foreign brands of craft beer and draft beer into Singapore. And sometimes when the competition authorities start looking into it, right, you realize that we don't even have to do anything. We don't even have to investigate the case or issue sanctions. When we start investigating, some of the parties being investigated, they are very cooperative. We tell them what are the issues, and they will give us voluntary undertakings or commitments, right, to alter their conduct. So actually, for this Asia Pacific brewery case I'm talking about, you do see, a lot of microbreweries, right, flourishing, in hawker centers, in some of the eateries and restaurants and what have you. And this actually changed the scene, the microbrewery scene in Singapore quite a bit. In the past, it was not. It was quite dominated by, some of the dominant chains. So I'm just sharing with you some of the examples as well. Likewise for Singapore, one of our PSA, the Port Singapore, or the port operator actually faced some obstacles, when they operated in Mumbai, India. And that's where we actually also approached CCI, which is the India Competition Authority, to look into the case. And actually, the case was also resolved without the authority having to take sanctions or penalty on the entity. And the entity is willing to alter a little bit of its conduct to facilitate, competition in the port operations. So this is just to share with you some of the benefits that the competition law can actually bring to businesses. Yeah. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Theo. Now for the next chapter, we have Mr. Jerry Clavesilas, the Director of Bureau of Small and Medium Enterprises Development at the Philippines Department of Trade and Industry. Mr. Jerry will talk about the SMEs chapter under RCEP agreement. You may have the screen, Mr. Jerry.
Thank you very much, Presti. So unlike the other chapters in the RCEP agreement, Chapter 14 on small and medium enterprises is not pertaining to the areas of agreements, but rather this refers to the sector that will most likely benefit from the provisions of the RCEP agreement. So we are very fortunate that for the first time, as far as we can remember, that there is this specific chapter on the small and medium enterprises in our FTA. So in the next slide, we will now be asking what is RCEP's SME chapter all about. We are very happy to note that the parties have to be cognizant of the benefit that will be brought about by the agreement to the SME sector, either currently or prospectively. So let us see now what are those provisions of this particular chapter pertaining to the small and medium enterprises. So here we can see in the next slide, we can see here that the objective of this provision is to promote information sharing and cooperation in increasing the ability to utilize and benefit from opportunities created by the RCEP. So the first item here that is being emphasized is information sharing among our SMEs in the region. So there is this suggestion that there will have to be an establishment and maintenance of publicly accessible information platform and information exchange to share knowledge, experiences, and best practices. This will facilitate the capacity building for the SMEs in order for them to take full advantage of the various opportunities in the region, encouraging efficient and effective implementation of facilitative and transparent trade rules and regulations. So that's how important the information is to our SMEs for them to be able to take advantage of the benefits that will be brought to them by this agreement. So the next item that is also emphasized here is on cooperation. By the way, I will be sharing in the succeeding slides some of the existing programs that we already have at the ASEAN, which might already be the start of this provision for our small and medium enterprises. The second item is, as I mentioned earlier, cooperation. So specific areas of cooperation include e-commerce, intellectual property rights, access to markets, and innovation, among others. So these are the two things that is now being emphasized in this chapter, that information sharing among our SMEs in the region, as well as cooperation. And in fact, cooperation will be discussed also in the succeeding presentation. But here, as I have said, that SMEs are the sectors that will benefit from the provisions of this agreement. So there are various items in the RCEP agreements that will most likely benefit our SMEs, and I will be sharing that also in the next slide. Another item that is also emphasized in this chapter is the establishment of contact points per member country. So this is necessary for our SMEs to have a referral unit wherein they can ask where they can be connected or how they can access this information, or even avail of these various cooperation undertakings in the region. So I think everybody is already familiar that under the ASEAN, we have this so-called ASEAN Coordinating Committee for MSMEs, or ACC MSME. So this can be now the contact points for the ASEAN member countries, but for the 5 other countries that I think have to be still identified for us to be able to also identify who will be our counterpart in these 5 countries. And another thing that is emphasized in this chapter is that the application of dispute settlement does not apply to any matter in this chapter. So this is actually the summary of what is being provided for our MSMEs, or rather the small and medium enterprises, because this is what has been mentioned in the agreement. It's only the small and medium enterprises. So in the next slide, we can see here, these are the things that will be benefiting our SMEs in the region. So as mentioned earlier by the director, that MSMEs now can access a huge market within the RCEP region with preferential tariff under simplified trade rules, and integrate themselves into the global value chain in the region. So as have been already explained earlier, RCEP is a market of 2.3 billion people, or 29% of the global population, making it the largest FTA in the world, with gross domestic product of US dollar 25.8 trillion, or 29% of global GDP. So it's 29% of the global population, 29% of the global GDP in 2020. And then the total trade flows in RCEP accounted for US dollar 10.1 trillion, or another 29% of the global trade during the same year, with exports reaching US dollar 5.4 trillion, or 32% of world exports, and imports amounting to US dollar 4.7 trillion, or 27%. So this here shows that the region is exporting more rather than importing. So the region is exporting 32% while importing 27%. So this is the opportunity. These are the opportunities that are now in store for our SMEs if they become competitive and if they join the global value chain in the region. So these are the potential benefit that they can really take advantage. And of course, we can also see here that RCEP provides for business-friendly mechanisms to facilitate trade through clear and transparent procedures. So including the competition that was earlier presented also. And then the economic cooperation facility of the TAI that will be presented later will also provide for capacity building and technical cooperation activities that will assist SMEs in using the agreement, boost the overall competitiveness, as well as promote their goods and services. And finally, provides for time-bound consultations to resolve issues and concerns on trade measures, such as non-tariff measures. So in the next slide, we can see here the summary of the features and the elements of the agreement which can be promoted to SMEs, or which can be accessed or availed of by our SMEs. Because as I have said, Chapter 14 refers to the sector that will most likely benefit from these various provisions. So number 1 here is the single rule of origin framework for the 15 member countries. Second is the wider area for sourcing of raw materials. Imagine 1/3 of the global economy will now be your source for raw materials. And then we also have the liberal product specific rules for specific products of interest. So it becomes clear for our traders now on what are the requirements for the specific products. And then we also have the flexible origin certification procedures, such as the certificate of origin, declaration of origin by approved exporter, declaration of origin by exporter or producer. So this actually refers to the exporter sector, but definitely the opportunity now is for our SMEs to be doing regional trade. So we expect that most of the interventions now that will be given, especially by the ASEAN member countries, is for their SMEs to become exporters in the region. Next is the electronic system for trade transactions. This will also facilitate doing business in the region by our SMEs. The detailed provisions on import licensing procedures will likewise facilitate them to understand what are the steps that they need to require to comply with. And then the rules on the NTMs, elaborate clear and predictable rules on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, as well as the technical barriers to trade. And lastly, the time-bound consultations to resolve these SPS and TBT issues. So in the last slide, we can see here now what are in our last slide, we can see down here some of the existing ASEAN projects that will help SMEs utilize RCEP. And I'm glad to share with you this afternoon. These are now the 3 major programs that are being implemented by the various committees or working groups at the ASEAN. First, we have the ASEAN Access. This with the tagline, "Your Business Information Gateway to ASEAN and Beyond." This is actually an initiative of the SME or Nsme, and being spearheaded by Thailand. This is an online portal serving as a first port of call for ASEAN SMEs and other businesses for information on trade and market access in ASEAN. ASEAN Access provides businesses interested in the ASEAN region with trade and market-related information and access to support services necessary to penetrate new markets. So this is already in compliance to what has been required in the Chapter 14, wherein the establishment of that information portal. So ASEAN already has the so-called ASEAN Access. In addition, we also have the ASEAN Trade Repository. This is a single point of access to all the trade-related information of ASEAN member states. The ASEAN Trade Repository is an ASEAN-level information technology interface linked by means of hyperlinks to a series of interoperable national trade repositories. So all the national trade repositories of the 10 member countries are being linked in this ASEAN Trade Repository that provide and maintain the national level trade-related information and the actual contents. So trade-related information accessible through the ATR is organized on the basis of 9 topics in line with Article 13 of the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement. So all the actual information is available on NTRs of the ASEAN member states and duly maintained by their respective governments. And lastly, the third program, this is the Asean Sme Academy. This is another initiative of the ECCMSME, and is being now lodged at the Philippine Trade Training Center. This academy offers free resources and services on ASEAN context specific, as well as networking opportunities for MSMEs to upgrade their capacity. The Asean Sme Academy provides different courses under the 7 specific business functions applicable to ASEAN SMEs, namely finance. These are courses relating to the management of finances of the business. We also have the human resources. These are courses related to the management of human resource. We have the management courses related to strategic planning and or other organization development activities related to structures and systems, among others. We have marketing, operations, technology, and trade and logistics. So these are the available training modules that can be downloaded by an SME, in fact, MSME in the ASEAN region, which we can now also make use for our cooperation in addition with the 5 member countries. So this we are now hopeful that with the existence of this various platform that can now be used by the RCEP as our initial contribution to our compliance to what has been provided for in our RCEP agreement. So with this, we are very optimistic that our SMEs will be able to join the regional value chain and be able to take advantage of the benefits and the opportunities that are in store for them. So this is all for the SME chapter 14 of our RCEP agreement. Thank you very much and good afternoon to everyone.
All right, thank you, Mr. Jerry. Now, to understand further the government procurement chapter, we have Mr. Pham Hung An, the head of International Cooperation of Public Procurement Agency at the Ministry of Planning and Investment of Vietnam. Over to you, Mr. Hung An.
Yeah. Thank you, Presti. Good afternoon, everyone. It's glad that I have an opportunity today to be here with you and we discuss the potential of unlocking RCEP for business in respect of government procurement. First, I'd like to send a big thank to the Asean Secretariat for their efforts to organize these webinar series with a view to achieving effective implementation of RCEP, supporting business community, and facilitating cooperation between the RCEP parties. That would be great. And also thank the dear participants, attendees for your time and attention. And I believe we are all confident that the RCEP agreement will establish a comprehensive and high-quality economic partnership among the parties to expand the regional growth and development. Aside from key elements, including trading goods and services, investment, the RCEP agreement also covers emerging areas such as government procurement, intellectual property, e-commerce, or the competition you just listened. Speaking of government procurement, it's noteworthy that the RCEP agreement is the first and only ASEAN Plus FTA that includes government procurement. The government procurement chapter in RCEP highlights the importance of promoting the transparency of laws, regulation, and procedures, and developing cooperation in government procurement among the parties. So having this government procurement chapter in RCEP is a welcome opportunity for each party, as the transparency and cooperation among the countries is the very first step into making local suppliers competitive when it comes to government procurement. So next slide, please. Let's get started with the objectives. The parties recognize the importance of promoting the transparency of laws, regulation, and procedures, and developing cooperation among the parties regarding government procurement specifically. So the message here is loud and clear: promoting transparency and developing cooperation first between RCEP parties. About the scope, the next session, please. The GB chapter in RCEP applies to the laws, regulation, and procedures of a party regarding government procurement implemented by its central government entities, just central government entities only, not about substantial or public undertakings or the SOEs. It's just focused on the implementation of central government entities. The procurement obligation do not also apply to RCEP 3 less developed countries, namely Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. But they still may benefit from the cooperation among the parties. In the next slide, we're gonna discuss the principles of the government procurement chapter. When it comes to the principles, the parties recognize the role of government procurement in furthering the economic integration of the region so as to promote growth and employment. Where government procurement is expressly open to international competition, the RCEP calls on the parties to conduct such procurement in accordance with generally accepted government procurement principles as applied by the parties. And next slide, please. The transparency. I would say this is the key area of the government procurement chapter. The parties agree that they will make publicly available its laws and regulations, and also endeavor to make publicly available its procedures regarding government procurement, which might include information on where tender opportunities are published. Equally important, consistent with modern procurement practices, to the extent possible and as appropriate, each RCEP country will endeavor to make available and update the information through electronic means and in English. They also specify the paper or electronic means utilized by that country to publish the information. In the next slides, we're gonna discuss the cooperation elements of the GB chapter. So next slide, please. Under the cooperation provision, the parties endeavor to cooperate on matters relating to government procurement to achieve a better understanding of each party's respective government procurement systems. Such cooperation may include exchanging information on parties' laws, regulation, and procedures, providing training, technical assistance, or capacity building to parties, and sharing information on these initiatives. It also includes sharing information, if possible, on best practices, including those concerning small and medium enterprises, including micro enterprises, and sharing information on electronic procurement systems. In addition, the government procurement chapter also includes a review article for the future improvement of the chapter itself. Under RCEP agreement, the parties do not have recourse to dispute settlement for any matter arising under its government procurement chapter. So, as takeaways, next slide, please. When RCEP negotiations were launched in 2013, if memory serves me right, the government procurement was not included. Procurement was just added in 2017, and the resulting procurement chapter is, I'd say, quite modest. And we cannot point out just now any clear tender opportunities under RCEP because it is silent on market assets. But it's a beginning. It helps bring together countries in the region and demonstrates the significance of these countries and helps with the harmonization of trade rules amongst the member countries, as well as sending a signal of the growing importance of ASEAN. So it's the first step for government procurement. It's promising, I'd say, very promising, and it's key to facilitating mutual understanding among the parties in respect of government procurement. Before the parties may agree, someday, who knows, to sit together in the future and decide on stronger commitments and cooperation. But for now, for business community, personally, I think it is most important now that you make yourselves aware of laws and regulation of RCEP parties' procurement systems before the markets are open for future tender opportunities. So I'd say, in a nutshell, that's all for my presentation on the government procurement chapter in RCEP. Thank you so much for your attention.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Pham Hong An. Now, our last presenter is a lady. She is a former head of Initiative for ASEAN Integration and Narrowing Development Gap Division at the ASEAN Secretariat. Ms. Wan Jun Lian will examine the Economic and Technical Cooperation chapter under the RCEP agreement. Over to you, Ms. Jun.
Thank you, Presti. Good afternoon to all. Yeah, I would like to join also the other speakers in thanking Asean Secretariat and also the East Asia Business Council for organizing this RCEP seminar. Okay, so the RCEP Chapter 15, Economic and Technical Cooperation. Let me just start to say that all ASEAN FTAs with external partners have an article or chapter on economic and technical cooperation. While the article or chapter may consist of much less commitments compared to chapters, particularly regarding market access, ASEAN deems this as an important component of ASEAN +1 FTAs. It institutes an obligation from the ASEAN FTA partner to allocate resources for technical assistance and capacity building to assist ASEAN member states, particularly the developing and least developed member states in implementing the FTA and ensure that all parties benefit from this agreement from the ASEAN +1 FTAs. Next slide. So the RCEP Chapter 15 on Economic and Technical Cooperation comprises of 7 articles. My presentation will focus on providing the brief of the content on each of the article and explain the rationale of some of the agreed texts. Next slide on objectives. Now, the objectives can be summarized into 2 main points. Firstly is to build upon existing economic cooperation in ASEAN +1 FTAs. This is to say that to minimize duplication of existing efforts and also to make sure that the effective utilization of resources. So it's on this slide you can see that all the partners in the RCEP, China, ROK, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, the FTAs, there is already a chapter article on economic cooperation and economic activities, economic and technical cooperation activities are being implemented under each of these FTAs. Right? Now, secondly, is to narrow development gap and maximize mutual benefits from the implementation of RCEP, recognizing the different levels of developments among RCEP parties. So within the 15 RCEP parties, they can be categorized into 3 different development stage. One is developed countries, that will be Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and you have least developed countries, Cambodia, Laos, PDR, and Myanmar, and the rest falls under the developing country category, including China and ROK, right? Here's to note that there are no WTO definitions of developed and developing countries. Basically, the countries announce for themselves whether they are developed or developing countries. Only the least developed countries are based on the UN category, right? They have this list of developed countries. Right? So you can see that it's a very vast difference within the 15 RCEP parties, right? Compared to if it's just only ASEAN, where we only basically have developing and least developed countries. Right? Now, on the next on scope, the chapter on economic technical cooperation was the first chapter in the RCEP agreement to conclude, and that was in October 2016. Right, so towards the end or even the conclusion of this chapter, the other chapters were in the midst of negotiations, and the negotiators basically could not predict what specific areas would require technical assistance and capacity building. So the scope specifies 7 broad priority areas, as you see on the slide, and provides the flexibility to include other areas in the future. Right? And likewise in the work program. So work program will be, next slide please. The work program will be on the specific activities, what kind of capacity building activities, and when they should be carried out. Now, again, since the chapter was concluded at a very early stage of the agreement, the article on work program specifies 3 activities that will be given priority in the future work program. and provides the flexibility to include other activities in the future. Next slide will be on resources. This was quite a challenging article for the negotiators. Resources here refers to monetary or funds and in kind, such as experts or trainers or venue, to help implement, to support the implementation of this chapter on the work or the implementation of the work program. Now, there was no consensus on a dedicated fund to support the implementation of future work program. One of the reasons is because parties recognize that ASEAN FTA partners have established cooperation funds to provide assistance to ASEAN, including funds that are specific for the implementation of ASEAN +1 FTAs. Right? For example, here, for example, Australia provides capacity building technical assistance to ASEAN through the ASEAN Australia Development Cooperation Fund Phase 2, which is the AADCP2. And Australia also supports the implementation of ANZ FTA through the ANZ FTA Economic Cooperation Support Program. So basically, there are two separate funds that's being supported by Australia to assist ASEAN. Right? Next slide, please. Now, this article is kind of interesting. It recognizes the constraints faced by least developed countries, right? So if you actually heard my earlier slide, I mentioned that there are 3 developed countries within the RCEP participating RCEP parties. There's Cambodia, Laos, PDR, and Myanmar. And this article allows for appropriate or additional capacity building technical assistance to help the 3 countries to implement the agreement. What is interesting is the title of this article, right? It specifies that LDC parties, which are ASEAN member states, right? So, which means that in the future, in the event least developed country were to join the RCEP, and that country is not a member of ASEAN, then this article will not apply to the new LDC party. Okay. Okay. Next is on the non-application of dispute settlement. I'll skip that. Title speaks for itself. That on the last slide on implementation, so the Economic Technical Cooperation will fall under the Committee on Sustainable Growth, a subsidiary body of the RCEP Joint Committee, as outlined in the RCEP Chapter 18 on institutional provisions. Now, how does this chapter benefit the private sector or businesses? Now, for the existing ASEAN +1 FTAs, economic cooperation activities, private sectors or businesses have participated in some of these activities. So there is potential for businesses to also benefit from this chapter, from capacity building technical assistance under the RCEP. So yeah, I end my presentation here. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Ms. June. Now, moving on to the next part of the program, we have a panel discussion where panelists will discuss the topics that have been elaborated earlier by the speakers from the perspective of government, academics, and private sector. For this session, I'd like to invite our moderator, Ms. Sarah. She is a Senior Officer of Competition, Consumer Protection, and IPR Division at the ASEAN Secretariat. Over to you, Ms. Sarah.
Thank you very much, Tiwi. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our panel discussion today will complement the presentations made by the 4 speakers earlier to discuss the implications and future prospects and outlook of RCEP with reference to the provisions under the 4 chapters. As stated in the Joint Leaders' Statement on RCEP in November 2020, RCEP agreement is an unprecedented mega regional trading agreement that comprises a diverse mix of economies and represents an important step forward towards an ideal framework of global trade and investment rules. Once again, the agreement enters into force on 1st of January next year. And so the consensus uniformly is that RCEP will dramatically bolster trade volumes within and outside the RCEP region. that will help contribute to global economic growth and development, as well as bring about market and employment opportunities to businesses in the region. With 20 chapters that are modern, comprehensive, high quality, and mutually beneficial, RCEP is expected to open a vast range of opportunities for businesses, including SMEs, located in the region, as well as to foster a competitive, innovative, and productive economic region. We are very fortunate today to be joined by a panelist of exceptional speakers, namely Ambassador Ina Hagningnintias Krishnamurthy, who is currently the advisor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs on Economic Diplomacy of Indonesia. From 2016 to 2019, she was a Deputy Permanent Representative of Indonesia to the United Nations in New York, and previously a Director for ASEAN Economic Cooperation from 2014 to 2016 at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia. Ambassador Ina holds a Bachelor of Arts majoring in Social Culture from the University of Indonesia and a Master's of Arts from the Faculty of International Studies of Griffith University, Brisbane, Australia. She also chaired the negotiations of the SME, e-commerce, and economic and technical cooperation chapters. Our second speaker is Professor Evelyn Devadasan from the Faculty of Business and Economics of the University of Malaya. She is also the Vice President of the Malaysian Economic Association and received her PhD in economics from the University of Malaya in 2006 and a Master's of Economics from the National University of Singapore in 1992. Her research focuses on international trade and regional integration. And our third speaker is Ms. Shanti Shamdasani, who is the CEO of ASEAN International Advocacy and Consultancy. Ms. Shamdasani is a seasoned government industry affairs, public policy, and business development professional with over 18 years of experience in Asia. She is known for her in-depth expertise on ASEAN matters, which focus on, among others, international trade, healthcare, digital transformation, and market entry strategies. She was instrumental in establishing the U.S. ASEAN Business Council office in Indonesia, and she has been involved in various capacities, including in the RCEP negotiations, working closely with government agencies. She is also an alumni of the Harvard Kennedy School. So let us begin with the first question of this session that I would like to ask all panelists. The signing of the RCEP agreement and its subsequent enactments in January comes at a time when the world is confronted with challenges brought about by the pandemic. Could you explain how will these provisions presented in the last session help to expedite economic recovery following the pandemic? Perhaps we can start with Ambassador Ina.
Thank you, Ibu Sarah. It's truly an honor for me to share a panel with two very distinguished panelists, Professor Evelyn and as well as Ibu Santi. Truly honor for me. And thank you to ASEC for inviting me to this very important event. To answer your questions, I think I just want to highlight two important points from the speakers, the four speakers that we just heard, that the four chapters highlights two important points, which is firstly, strong push on cooperation. RCEP is very mindful of the development gap between RPC, so therefore the four chapters highlight in very important elements of cooperation. And secondly, I think I would like to mention that RCEP is it's a framework aimed at further lowering trade barriers and securing improved market access for goods and services for business in the region. As well, it is very important to safeguard free trade and counter protectionism, so that therefore, and be mindful that economic recovery post-pandemic, of course, we need more trade and more investment rather than lesser. So I think the second point that we need to highlight in that regard, the 4 chapters truly aim at facilitating the trade and investment between the RPCs. My third point from the presentation, we see that to achieve both important elements that I have just mentioned, we need to have a solid and an ease of doing business in the region. That is why I think the 4 chapters highlight the importance of RCEP as push and pull factors in creating an environment, a business environment that is supportive to the regional value chain. I think that's 3 points that I can kind of take up from the presentations, all speakers. Thank you, Ibu Sarah.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ina. Very well said. Professor Evelyn, would you like to share your views?
Thank you, Ms. Sarah. Firstly, I'd like to record my sincere thanks to the ASEAN Secretariat for the opportunity to share my views. Coming back to your question, if you look at the pandemic, what we see is the rise of the digital economy. And here I'd like to link with the importance of the competition chapter. So I'd probably focus my comments on the competition chapter per se and the provisions in the competition chapter. Now, competition policy is very important for shaping an integrated e-commerce market and also getting the SMEs to be involved. Now, here I'd like to highlight the provisions in the RCEP on anti-competitive conduct has instigated, let's look at a case study, China, has instigated some reforms in China. So I won't say it expedites economic recovery. Economic recovery takes time, but the provisions per se have actually instigated some changes. And if you look at China, which anchors a lot of giant platforms, e-commerce platforms, how they have actually changed or reformed their policy. One is before 2020, before the RCEP, the competition agency in China scarcely conducted any antitrust investigations into e-commerce. They sort of took on an accommodative stance. Now, having realized that they're not able to fulfill the RCEP commitments, they have now decided to take a proactive anti-monopoly rationale towards e-commerce platforms to ensure that they adhere to competitive practices. Now, one interesting thing was the 1 out of 2 practice by Alibaba. The concerns were raised for a long time, but the competition policy did not take, the competition agency did not take any action. And what is this 1 out of 2 practice is where online retailers were only allowed to choose one e-commerce platform. Now that could actually preclude competing platforms from surviving. It also could restrict consumer choice. So what they did is, despite having the anti-monopoly law and the e-commerce law in China, they did not take that proactive action. Second, China realized that together with competition policy, one subset of competition policy is antitrust laws. And this is where the importance is. The RCEP provides broad obligations and specific requirements on anti-competitive behavior. One of it, antitrust laws, are very important because they direct private sector behavior. And it was mentioned by the speaker, Mr. Teo, what was the some of this anti-competitive behavior of the private sector, price fixing collusion between firms to collusion between firms to restrict output. And the most important is the abuse of a dominant position, because we have giant platforms such as Alibaba, JD.com, and so on. And this is where China realized that their antitrust laws were deficient because they were based on the traditional approach of using price-related approaches. You see, today, e-commerce platforms have access to a lot of data and they can misuse consumer data. How can they do it with algorithms? They can actually find out who are their faithful clients. So they can actually give personalized offerings. And at the same time, they were also starting to have price differentials. So this is where China decided they cannot adhere to the traditional approach. And they came up with a new guideline, which is called the Anti-Monopoly Guideline on Platform Economy 2021. So what we see from this RCEP agreement is that this competition policy and the provisions, they're very important. They lay a broad framework for countries to move and comply with these commitments, and they also instigate in the case of China. And China is a good illustrative case example simply because it hosts giant platforms. So these are issues I think that are very important. But having said that, is it enough? Is it sufficient? No. The agreement is still very broad. So the provisions, there's still a lot of work, because to comply with these commitments, a lot of domestic reforms are needed. And we know domestic competition laws need to keep pace with the rapid changes in the digital environment. They need to see, you have to move from a traditional approach of using price-related approaches of efficiency standards, which rely on price indicators. Yeah, just now Mr. Teo mentioned price is not the only issue. Indeed, price is not the only issue, because if you misuse consumer information, that is a bigger issue, and that does not get reflected in the price. Consumers may actually get on the platform free. So when it does not get reflected, how do you prove that there's an abuse of market dominance? So this calls for a new approach. So this example shows you that countries become sensitive to the importance of competition policy because they want to make sure they adhere to it, but the reforms are going to take a lot of time. So I look at it that this is really an unfinished agenda. You cannot expedite it. It's a slow process, but nevertheless, it's a start. I have some more information on SMEs. Probably we can come back on that. So I would say that the competition policy indeed is an important chapter to instigate reform. May not expedite recovery, but that reform is needed to support the e-commerce and eventually the inclusion of SMEs and their participation on the e-commerce platforms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Evelyn. Ms. Shanti, would you like to share your views?
Sure. Thank you for that, Sarah. I would like to thank the ASEAN Secretariat and East Asia Business Council. And it's an honor to be here with the distinguished speakers. Very quickly, I'd like to take a bit of a different angle. I think what we have seen, this is not just RCEP driven, but this is more also COVID driven. At the onset of 2020, when COVID first started, we see three things very prominent: the SME, digital transformation, and e-commerce. All these three aspects become so expedited that even we were overwhelmed. Even I was working on RCEP since the last, maybe 7-8 years, along with, Imam Pambagio and, Donna and other people within the Ministry of Trade of Indonesia. But you see, these are the three common elements which all of us, and wherever you go, people will be talking about these three elements, right? But what I would like to particularly highlight here is that, and this is not what we have seen. So I want to take a bit of a different angle and a bit of a business angle. And to your question, in terms of which provision would we need to push in order to expedite the economic recovery, right? That was the question. And the provision which I see, and we have seen a lot of technology, SME, e-commerce being pushed, and a lot of that discussion at RCEP level. But the one provision which I see holds a lot of potential and also a roadblock here is chapter 9, where it says temporary movement of natural person. And this is less talked about, but when COVID started, there was such a dire need of medical experts and medical sourcing capacity, where every country have shortages of medical professionals. This is just one example, and I'm not just talking about medical professionals. I'm talking about professionals from other fields and other areas as well, right? So there seems to be a lot of opportunities in this healthcare area, where if we were to take up this chapter 9, look into this aspect in terms of how the government, how business views this, there is a lot of potential, untapped potential in this area, which can be used to expedite economic development. I think that's one which I would like to highlight. The other one, which I would like to highlight here is that, and I'm just talking this a little bit more from a business perspective, because the question was more of an economic related, is that there are key elements for business growth here, which I think we all need to understand. And this start to surface, this has been in RCEP, but this starts to surface in 2020 even more strongly. And the number one element, which is very much important to business growth, is IP, intellectual property, which still is the talk of every meetings and every businesses, even whether at regional ASEAN level or non-ASEAN level. This is the concern. It is even more of a concern at ASEAN level because we are mostly a developing country. So this becomes a prominent issue. Of course, the number two is e-commerce, and I think Her Excellency Ina and Professor Evelyn have mentioned. The speakers also have mentioned those. SMEs is one part which is also very, very pertinent to the business growth. And then what we see also key to the future development of economic recovery is the economic and technical cooperation. Now, this is one area here in terms of economic and technical cooperation. We have seen things have got outside of RCEP for a while in the form of FTAs. I think there was one presentation, I think it was Mr. Pham, which presented about the FTAs that shares a similar chapter or similar provisions which are also within RCEP. So the question here is, do we want to take it moving forward? Do we want to take this into the RCEP platform and dilute the current FTAs? How do we want to go about doing it? Because there are, I think up to now, there are like more than 1,000 over FTAs being signed, and it is continuously being signed, especially by those countries who are not able to participate at RCEP. So they've taken this FTA on the side. So this is one area of concern with regards to economic recovery, because is it RCEP driven? Is it FTA driven? What is driving this? Because the provisions are similar, the directions are similar, the end results are sometimes similar. So you need to kind of like pull back a little bit and then see from an economic recovery purposes, which one is more feasible, to push. And of course, government procurement is also one aspect, which I think in order to expedite the economic recovery, the chapters on government procurement needs to be deeply looked into, because transparency has always been an issue in Southeast Asia, well, not just Southeast Asia, but many parts of the world, right? And then lastly, dispute settlement. There is still a lot of concerns in the way dispute settlements are being conducted in this part of the world, and I think it would be a very key element in economic recovery, because when you're talking about economic recovery, you're talking about attracting FDI, right? So if you're talking about attracting FDI, then you need to kind of like pave the way in terms of what happens in the areas of dispute settlements and whatnot. Foreign investors need to be confident in this one. So there are, I think I could go on and with this discussion, but I believe, Sarah, you have more questions for us. I will not just, finish all my bullets in one go, but, we can share that as and when we continue with the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shanti. So yes, we take note that the RCEP agreement takes into account the development gaps, lower trade barriers, provide ease of doing business, and also all of the highlighted points that you've mentioned, all panelists mentioned on the importance of the chapters highlighted, the 4 chapters that are focused the focus of our discussion today. And also the importance of ensuring transparency such as those that are highlighted in the government procurement chapter. So thank you for all the wonderful answers that you have provided. The next question that I would like to ask to all panelists is, from your perspective, what are the short-term and long-term implications of these provisions under the 4 chapters of the agreement? And how do these provisions benefit businesses, particularly SMEs? Now, some of the presenters have highlighted this, but perhaps you would like to elaborate. Thank you. Maybe we can start with Professor Evelyn.
Thank you, Ms. Sarah, again for that question. I find it difficult to distinguish short-term and long-term, so probably I look at it from a broader perspective and get the overall implications. I've always grappled with how SMEs are going to increase their linkages with MNCs, and how are they going to participate more or enhance their participation in GVC linkages. I think there are 2 points of consideration here when we look at the SME chapter. One, we need to understand is that opportunities will coexist with competition. Very often people tend to look at it one-sided in terms of the opportunities. No doubt the unified rules, the provision for cumulation or the cumulation rule and the simplification of customs procedures, they all deserve merits in their own right. Yeah, but SMEs have to understand that there's competition from MNCs, there's going to be competition from China, which already they have unparalleled comparative advantages in their supply chains. And there's also going to be competition from Vietnam, a low-cost supplier. Second is a very important consideration we need to take care of is that the capability of SMEs differs substantially. So not all will have a potential to integrate, whether to regionalize or internationalize, or also or whether to just integrate with GVCs, whether it's the regional or global level. So the first sub-question I would ask is, how can SMEs actually participate in GVC linkages, and how are these linkages going to materialize? What should be done differently from what is being done? We know they are stuck. They find it difficult. There's a lot of financing issues and so on. So I think it's important to look at their participation, whether it's direct or indirect through trade, or is it going to be through domestic linkages by hooking on with foreign investors? The second, I think, is more important. When we talk about linkages today, it's not just the extent of the SME MNC linkage, it's also the quality of the linkage, because we want to make sure they are that the interactions between MNCs and SMEs are repetitive. It's not a one-off linkage, and that they are tied with FDI. OECD talks a lot about this, how linkages through FDI are very, very important. So I think that's a second issue that we need to think of. So the implication of this is that for governments, a one-size policy fits all to help SMEs is not going to work. There's a big difference in their capacity. So this requires national level intervention, not just to targeted fiscal incentives, but also multi-tiered linkage programs. And I think Singapore is doing quite well in some of this business matching with some of these SMEs that are already at the forefront, we could say first tier suppliers. Okay. Second, I would think it's like also to streamline the procedures. And this is where I think the Ecotech chapter is very, very important. Now, we talk about streamlining procedures at the regional level, but how do you streamline at the regional level when, let's say, in the food sector, they are already not on the international, let's say, they are not following international standards. Their framework is not along Codex Alimentarius. So it would be difficult to streamline if they're coming from different backgrounds with different regulatory framework. It'll also be difficult to streamline because we know it is not the NTM per se. From our research with the food and beverage industry, it's not the NTM per se. It's actually the procedures. And those procedures go back to domestic reform. You know, red tape, duplication of documents, meeting several ministries just to get a permit or an approval. So a lot of this we need to look into. The second question I think would be very important is to what extent can SMEs expand into the e-commerce space when we look at the implication. Here, we need to consider the China factor, and I think Malaysia has recognized this. They're already talking about cross-regional SME trade pacts with China and soliciting more technical cooperation for Malaysian SMEs with China, especially in the telecommunication sector. And the third, I think Ms. Wan mentioned about this new emerging issues, the Committee on the New Emerging Issues. When we talk about SMEs, they cannot run away from considering environmental and social issues, because MNCs are all about responsible conduct and standards are filtered through the supply chain. So SMEs need to signal safe sourcing, responsible sourcing, sustainable sourcing. So this ESG environmental social governance should be mainstreamed in their businesses. So I think along these three questions, how can they participate more? How can the linkages materialize? To what extent can they hook onto the e-commerce space? And how willing are SMEs to change their business model to take into account environmental and social considerations? All this takes time. So I believe we should look at RCEP as setting the base, but it will require a lot of adjustments, and the adjustments may come faster for some and slower for the others. So it's definitely a lot of domestic reforms are needed in this case. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you very much, Professor Evelyn. Can I ask Ambassador Ina to share your views?
Yes, I would like to echo what Professor Evelyn just mentioned about reforms or restructuring domestically. But before elaborating what I want to, perhaps looking back at the negotiation process, Ibu Sarah, for some of you who do not know that the negotiation of SMEs under RCEP is not an easy negotiations, because the economies in Australia, New Zealand, as well as Japan, although they are considered to be developed economy, they also supported by SMEs. So the negotiations are not as smooth as we want to be, because the understanding needs to be, Professor Evelyn already mentioned about this, different background, different support, different everything. So the chapter on SMEs is built upon the Ecotech chapter. The Ecotech chapter is based on ASEAN +1, the existing one. The mechanics of it, the machinery of it, that chapter is basically ASEAN +1. But the SMEs chapter is purely, and I thank you for the flexibility of all RPCs, the SMEs chapter is built upon ASEAN SMEs norms, sort of. I think Jerry already mentioned about that. So in the negotiation itself, it is apparent what Professor Evelyn said, that there's a process that needs to be pushed as well as pull. I think I have mentioned this in answering your first question, Ibu Sarah, that RCEP is sort of becoming a locomotive. Professor Evelyn mentioned about what happened with Alibaba. Also a pull factor, because then the more advanced economies pulling the less developed. So it's actually the chapters of Ecotech SMEs is very good examples of the push and pull factor mechanics of RCEP. Professor Evelyn and Ibu Santi already mentioned about e-commerce. Although this webinar is not going to speak to have a discussion on e-commerce, I just want to mention this because it is also a very challenging chapter, because most of us in ASEAN, it is the first time ever we have this sort of like SEPA with e-commerce, norm setting, norm shaping kind of a chapter. So it is very challenging negotiation during our before signing, which is 2019-2020. So back to my points that I referred to Professor Evelyn regarding reforms. I think the key benefits from RCEP depend critically on the participation and positioning of the respective ASEAN countries in global value chain for both manufacturing goods and services. But with that regard, to gain or to experience positive gains from RCEP, countries need to undertake deeper and enhanced structural reforms to fully benefit from the agreement. And it is a process. It takes time. The nationals needs to be prepared for the implementation of RCEP. The potential role, I think, for the SMEs in that regard, we already acknowledge that SMEs, well, also the micro entrepreneurs, they are the building blocks of the ASEAN's economy. So I think perhaps if the ASEAN countries undertake policy to induce structural transformation of their industry, to transform their industries to higher value added activities, and in the end support the GVC activities, perhaps could help the MSME, like Professor Evelyn said, perhaps could help SMEs, including the micro, to kind of enjoy and benefit from RCEP. As well, digital transformation for sure will accelerate. I think we have seen it during COVID, but at the same time, there is a kind of a race between the norm setting, the norm shaping, as well as the literacy, the technology to support the digital transformation. We have seen that digital or digitalization accelerate the business activities, and therefore ASEAN countries need to develop a policy framework to manage the structural transformation of the services sector through digital innovation and automation. So perhaps with RCEP, we could provide the framework to manage the structural transformation of services, trade, and investment in this period. So like I said, since the beginning, RCEP can be the locomotive, but at the same time could narrow the gap between the RPCs, because although we have different backgrounds, we need to kind of learn that RCEP cannot be successful without everyone on board. So there is, we need to be mindful that we need to make policy that leave no one's behind. Thank you, Ibu Sarah.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ina, and thank you for answering the question by drawing from your experience in negotiating the agreements in the various chapters. Perhaps Ms. Shanti can provide your views.
Yeah, I think Professor Evelyn and Her Excellency Ina have covered most of it. I will not take a lot of time, but I want to share one interesting piece of information here. And I think if there is anyone that we have seen very evidently now that have benefited from RCEP, I think I'll take the example of Philippines. I mean, RCEP have not started, but they have kind of like just implemented quite a few directives towards that area. This is the information from the Department of Trade and Industry in Philippines. And And it says that RCEP accounted 50% of the Philippines export market and 61% of Philippines import sources last year. So this, we are talking about 2020, right? So I'll repeat that, it's 50% of the Philippines export market and 61% of Philippines import sources. And this is in 2020. And so what I want to really highlight here, I mean, there seems to be an early winner, even if it's not activated yet, but there seems to be a pathway towards kind of like showing where Philippines is kind of leading, how the provisions within RCEP can actually, benefit them. Just very quickly, I want to add on the e-commerce part, right? And I think in terms of long-term and mid-term, and I agree with Professor Evelyn, that I don't see this as a short-term, because RCEP is a huge task, right? You can't have short-term, low-hanging fruit for RCEP. It's a huge undertaking. So what I would like to kind of like emphasize here, especially with e-commerce, I think in terms of mid-term to long-term, what we need to continue to do is to leverage technology in cross-border trade. I think we have seen that taking place, and that needs to continue to happen. So the leverage of technology in cross-border trade, uniform system facilitating, again, harmonization standard. This has been the buzzword at ASEAN for many, many years, right? But I think this is even more so prominent because we need a uniform system facilitation methods, right? Then paperless trading, I don't think so anyone have touched on this area, but paperless trading have proven, especially in COVID time where contactless transaction is required, paperless trading have actually cut bureaucracy at least to 30%. And it has actually benefited the e-commerce and also the SMEs in this matter. So I think if we can continue to push for paperless trading in terms of getting approvals and licensing and all those things via online, and you don't have to meet people, and sometimes you meet people, you have to carry a thick envelope, right? So that would be cut, right? And then what we also need is a digitalized solution, and it's kind of like one country will have one app and the other country will have the other app, and they're not talking to each other, right? Whereas we are under one RCEP umbrella. So if RCEP could come up with some kind of an app that creates uniformity to facilitate this, that would be even better, right? So the technology can talk to each other. The automation of trade-related processes and logistics. Again, I think somebody did mention about sustainable logistics, and I think this is one area where we see requires a lot of room of improvement, where automation still, it is there, it is taking place, but we still need a lot of automation in order to move forward. I think that's just the point that I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shanti, for sharing your insights. So now I would like to ask the panelists to explain how governments or parties to the agreement will or should implement the agreed provisions under the 4 chapters, and how do governments plan to monitor its implementation and efficacy. And maybe an additional question to Professor Evelyn and Ms. Shanti, what should businesses do in order to reap the benefits from these provisions? Maybe perhaps we can start with Ambassador Ina.
Okay, thank you, Ibu Sarah. I don't know about other ASEAN countries, but I can speak about Indonesia. We in our strategy, I think there are some parts that are still needs to be monitored as well as pushed. For sure, we are still taking priority issues when it comes to RCEP, because like Professor Evelyn said, that the structural reform needs to be done continuously, and because RCEP is a huge undertaking, we need to kind of focus on or making priorities of issues that are still lacking domestically. Secondly, for sure, we need to see whether some kind of existing regulations, because chairing the ecotech, be mindful of ASEAN Plus One and other FTAs that we are engaging on. We need to kind of identify the existing commitments that we have within RCEP as well as within the Plus One, and on top of that, other FTAs with other countries and other areas. That is also very important because like ecotech, it is very specific that RCEP, the ecotech itself is very specific on RCEP issues only, not on other issues outside RCEP. So we need to identify the existing commitments. And secondly, we need to also, this is what I said about push and pull factors, Ibu Sarah. In our national development planning, we also include SDGs 2030. That is why we need to incorporate the commitments under RCEP as well as our effort to achieve SDGs into our norm setting or norm shaping sort of domestically. Now, the stage 4, this is extremely important, and Professor Evelyn mentioned this over and over again about policy adjustment in sectors that are important for RCEP or under RCEP. And of course, this whole package needs to be kind of strategized in an national action plan so that we could have a mitigation as well as monitoring in place. On top of that, we have visions from our presidents regarding the human resources, especially because, like what I said early on, that this push and pull factor needs a capacity and capability of our human resources to kind of answer the challenge. Professor Evelyn mentioned about the emerging issues with COP26 commitments, with the G20 in our front door and our chairmanship in 2023. Of course, human resource department needs to be strengthened in that regard. As well, there is no ease of doing business without strengthening the infrastructure and connectivity. And that's also the vision of our president on infrastructure, be it hard infrastructure as well as the soft infrastructure, like what we have mentioned about digital and digitalization. Ease of doing business, of course, bureaucracy as well as regulations, in particular on investments, are in place. Some of them are still challenging in the implementation of it, but we are learning by doing. So of course, we need to learn from the experience as well as sharing knowledge from other ASEAN countries. And lastly, we need to transform our economy so that we are ready to kind of cope with the needs and as well as the push of RCEP being part of the strong GVC. With RCEP, we will have the regional rule of origin, the ROO. It's a challenge in itself when we build a system as complicated and as comprehensive as RCEP. So transforming economy is very important so that we can be part of the GVC. Thank you, Ibu Sarah.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Ms. Shanti, can I seek your views?
So I think just I'd like to answer this direct to the point, because if we are talking about government role in terms of implementing and monitoring this processes, within the government itself, we have seen quite a lot of challenges. There are a lot of issues in terms of transparency, in terms of tender processes, monopolistics, and all that thing. But let me just go back and focus on the role of government, right? Which is actually creating regulation and policies. And I think one way of supporting this is for government to either become a digitized government, like the ones in UK and a few other countries where they are interconnected, which makes it even more easy to track the implementation of RCEP, see what is happening in other countries, which I think is less likely to happen because of the huge cost associated with it. So I'll forget option number one now. Option number two is for government to really set up a framework of its own. So you have over here, you have RCEP, which have all this, 20 chapters and whatnot. I think government need to set up a separate framework that is attached to RCEP with a separate team members to really oversee, and their job, or maybe just a ministry or a DG level or a separate department, that their job is just to monitor where RCEP is on a weekly, on a daily basis, right? I think this is what I think is most feasible, because if you have RCEP going on its own, you need to have a supervision body, a supervisory body that is attached to it to kind of like see what transpired at that level. That's option number two. Option number three, I think, is like government needs to put up, and this is maybe short-term or mid-term, government can put up regulations and policies that can actually become embedded into the RCEP processes in order to make it work faster. So I think these are the three options which I see how the government, what kind of role the government can play moving forward in terms of implementing and monitoring the RCEP processes.
Thank you, Ms. Shanti. Professor Evelyn.
In terms of the role of the government, I probably link to the Ecotech chapter. I think that's an important chapter because it covers a bit of scope. So I'll look at trade in goods as mentioned just now. What is lacking in RCEP? It's not the NTM, it's the design and implementation of the NTM. And that varies across all the states. There are also capacity constraints among the weaker economies. So we have seen evidence of how if you actually streamline the conformity assessment procedures and have mutual recognition, how that can reduce compliance costs substantially. And a lot of this is related to compliance procedures attached to the SPS and TBT, although today we're not talking about the SPS and TBT, but they linked ultimately to the SMEs engagement. So through the Ecotech chapter, one thing we need to recognize, we have advanced economies there, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. So I think governments need to tap technical assistance, technical consultations on how they can best design some of these NTMs to reduce compliance costs. Now, if I could just share Malaysia's case very quickly, when Area and UNTAD came up with the NTM database, okay, transparency was there on what are the NTMs in the 10 countries, but it didn't stop there because a lot of the obstacles were in the procedures. So what Malaysia did is they did an audit or a review of the NTMs under the different ministries, and they went down to the details to see what are the SOPs to get an NTM. And when they did that, they could actually identify where is the duplication, where is the problem? And in doing so, they had two different engagements. One was with the ministry and one was the businesses. So the businesses had an opportunity to give their input. Now, having done that, they assessed what was the business compliance cost. They had a World Bank methodology and they did some estimations of that and they presented it to the ministry. Now, does it stop there? I think a lot of this is needed at the country level, but it should not stop there because other countries need to do the same. It cannot be just one country reforming and facilitating trade because we are exporting and importing. So I think that's where area recommended there should be a mechanism or a reporting mechanism, whether it's at the ASEAN level or at the RCEP level, to see to what extent countries have reformed their domestic procedures, because you can't leave it to the political will of the individual countries. Some will move, some won't move. So that reporting mechanism will probably coerce some countries to sort of build up their infrastructure and facilitate trade. So that is one that I see. The second that I see is, as I mentioned just now, in the case of China, how they reformed, but we still need a lot of sharing of best practices. And the Ecotech chapter is very important because we really need to enhance our electronic commerce legal framework. It's pointless to talk about SMEs getting on the e-commerce platform if there are a lot of issues with data protection, data privacy, and so on. So this again, we need probably the developed countries to come in. I think the Australia, if I stand corrected on this, the Australia, New Zealand, I guess, FTA has an e-commerce chapter, I believe. So maybe it could expand and develop, it may not be just expanding the scope of provisions, but it may be having in-depth commitments and getting in-depth commitments realized through best practices. And the third one I see is, I'm very keen on this emerging issues. I think firms cannot escape that eventually, whether they're SMEs. And can you imagine SMEs are grappling to even internationalize? And now they have to showcase the fact that they're engaging in sustainable trade. That's like a double blow for them. So how do we assist? We need to get special programs to actually lead to a transfer of knowledge on, let's say, what you mean by decent work and how do you ensure decent work. Malaysia has been earmarked for forced labor and we've seen trade bans and so on. So how do we ensure that there is a will for SMEs and they're willing to change their business model to engage in decent work, labor policies, and may not just be SMEs. MNCs are also culprits to bad practices. So probably this is where the government can play a role. And I see the Ecotech chapter is very important within the RCEP. There's a lot of technical cooperation in the separate chapters, but I think the Ecotech chapter covers overall. There are a lot of e-commerce, linking trade with labor and environment, and addressing procedural obstacles at the regional level and bringing it at the domestic level, and then bringing it to the regional level to ensure there's an enforcement or monitoring mechanism. So I think the monitoring mechanism should be at the regional level, but the reforms done at the domestic level. Only then can we streamline some of these measures. Otherwise, we have a lot of MRAs, as we have seen, but they have very limited effects. So to ensure that the RCEP sees something beyond what we have seen in the ASEAN +1 agreements. So I think that would be my general comment. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Evelyn. And thank you all panelists for answering the questions and providing very thought-provoking answers to the questions that I've posed. Now that we've heard from all speakers and panelists, I would like to open the floor for a question and answer session. I believe that the questions can be accessed through the chat function. And we have a few questions here. Perhaps give me a minute to go through the questions. I believe there was a question on competition. And basically, Mr. Teo has actually provided a written response to this, but perhaps I could just invite him to answer the question, is there any case study or actual examples of international business practices that is categorized as anti-competitive and be handled officially, maybe in other FTAs? And then also another question on state-owned enterprise, and whether this constitutes, the establishment constitutes an anti-fair, anti-competitive conduct. her behavior. So, Mr. Teo, would you like to take the floor?
Hi, Sarah. So I think the categorization of the anti-competitive conduct, like I mentioned, there are usually three broad categorization under the competition law for most jurisdictions, falling under either anti-competitive agreement, cartels, or abuse of dominance, or anti-competitive mergers. Having said that, right, sometimes the conduct itself, right, may not clearly just fall within a particular category. It is possible for it to be both. So I just give you an example. You know that in Singapore, right, we took actions against Grab Uber for anti-competitive merger. But there are actually people who actually question whether, instead of looking at it as a merger, could it actually be an anti-competitive agreement between the two parties? Because on the face, it looks as though it's a merger because Grab actually, kind of merge with, or rather Uber merge with Grab, exit from the Singapore market and have a stake in Grab itself. So when you look at it, you can look at it as a merger. But there are also people who actually say that you can actually look at it as anti-competitive agreement in that Uber and Grab actually agree to split the market. In other words, Uber agree to take itself out from Singapore, from Southeast Asia, and let the Southeast Asia market just be dominated by Grab. So actually, sometimes this kind of categorization, right, may not be very meaningful because you don't want to get yourself trapped into the nomenclature of the conduct itself. What you want is really to look into the effect of the conduct itself, how that actually affects competition. Now, if you look at the conduct, whether it's a merger or whether it's anti-competitive agreement, the fact is that Uber actually exited from Singapore for the Southeast Asian market, and Grab is really now one of the dominant players, at least in Singapore, for the ride-hailing market. And what actually happened after that? We realized that commission fees go up, the incentives to driver get scaled down, fare increase. Gojek tried to make penetration into the Singapore market but faced quite a lot of difficulties because, like what Professor Evelyn actually mentioned, they are not really ride-hailing companies. If you look at them, they are actually technology companies. Ride-hailing is just a service that they provided, but enabled through technology because it's the algorithm behind the matching services behind the match drivers and commuters. And it is the technology that they are actually in the business that they are really in, which is why I think Professor Evelyn also mentioned why it's very important for us to look into data monopolization. Because what the companies really want is really data. Because in this era of big data and data analytics, right, data actually offer a great deal of valuable insights for the competitors. And actually sometimes competitors find it hard to penetrate into the market. It's precisely they cannot have the necessary data, consumer data, to understand their behavior, to understand their patterns and what have you. So data monopolization is also an area that competition authority is looking at. So I'll just give you an example. Yeah. So I think there was also a question about the central bank government, right, allowing banks to take on developmental role as well as also take on commercial activity. So if you ask me, right, ideally there should be a segregation or separation of role. The developmental role should be carved out, separated from the commercial activities. However, for certain reasons, I can also understand why the government may want integration. But if that's really the case, right, what happens is that you must make sure that at least for the commercial aspect, right, the bank should be able to compete fairly with other banks on commercial, just pertaining to the commercial activities. You need to ensure that the developmental policy aspect, right, which the banks are involved in, right, they do not leverage advantage on that part, right, to disadvantage its competitors in the commercial area. So that is what the competition authority to step in, work with the relevant government agency like the central bank in Singapore will be the Monetary Authority of Singapore to make sure that such conditions are met. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor, for your elaborate answer. I note that there are some questions that I've already answered by Ms. June. Perhaps, June, you could also assist to answer this question. Is it correct to understand that RCEP is most advantageous advantageous amongst the previous or existing FTAs. That is the FTA that covered all limitations and adds refinements from previous FTAs.
Thank you, Sarah. So yeah, also thank you for the question. Yeah, so basically all ASEAN Plus 1 FTAs, as I mentioned, have Ecotech chapter, right, or ETC chapter. And they're all doing, you know, their own activities and so on. So basically RCEP recognizes that. And to make sure that there's no duplication, but I would assume that going forward, the activities will be, you know, it may be the same title, but then you have now 15 countries involved compared to ASEAN Plus 1 FTAs where, you know, you only have 11 or, you know, 12 when ASEAN FTA is concerned. Yeah, so that's what it means by building up, you know, to build up from the existing activities, efforts under the ASEAN Plus 1 FTAs. Yeah. Right. To be mindful that, you know, the resources is limited, so to make sure that the projects value add to the existing activities on the FTA. Yeah. I just want to add to what Professor Evelyn also mentioned about the importance of Ecotech. Thank you for highlighting that. Yes, it has played a very significant role in FTAs because, again, yeah, I would take on what Ibu Ina has mentioned about the push and pull sector. I think FTAs are an important platform for developing and least developed countries to actually streamline their rules, you know, to actually improve the facilities and so on, because it's basically a commitment that they have made at the regional level. And that's where the technical assistance capacity building has to come in. Because if not, you know, leaving them on their own, it will take, yeah, long, very, very long time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, June, for your answer. I believe that we've addressed all of the questions that are in the chat function. Perhaps, do we still have time, Presti? I think we still have time.
Yep, we still have one more questions if there is any.
Okay, time for one more question. Perhaps I may take this opportunity to ask the question to our dear panelist. And basically the question is, the chapters do allow parties to temporarily exempt in the form of traditional arrangements, for example. And I think we've also heard government procurement excludes some countries from taking part in the chapters. So the question is, will these reduce the benefits that could be gained from RCEP, as some has sought to believe? Perhaps I can ask Ambassador Ina to firstly answer this question.
Okay, I don't want to answer it by you know, referring to the current status of each RPCs, but I want to reflect on what did happen during the negotiations. Different with other gigantic SEPA, RCEP do not have side note or footnote or flagging or whatever. It's a clean document. It is a clean document because it is inclusive. Be very mindful of the narrowing to the effort of RCEP to narrow the development gap. So it's different than this is what happened during the negotiations. So the TNC over and over and over again emphasize that RCEP is very unique in nature because we have 3 different levels of development in the 16. During the negotiation, there are 16. And also the number of population are also staggering. the economic growth also different. So be very mindful with these circumstances, and also be very mindful that we are also 16 countries engaging with other regions. Therefore, the principle of inclusivity, and as well as giving everyone the space. I think what Pa Iman always give directive to us is the policy space, different policy space to different countries. Therefore, the RCEP is very clean agreement. So with that reference, I think the -1 is not against ASEAN Charter anyways. As well, we did it in the past with ASEAN -1 arrangement. So in RCEP, it is not -1, but to giving space. Like for example, the most clear example is the chapter on e-commerce. The chapter on e-commerce, it gives policy space to LDCs, 5 years transition plus 3. So in total 8. For those countries who still are converging or establishing or whatever you call it on the measures, national measures, we kind of agree on 5 years. So it's leveling, it's not non-inclusive. I think it is inclusivity in nature in that regard, because it gives space to different circumstances and different background. Thank you, Ibu Sarah.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ina. And I note the importance of allowing flexibility for countries to be able to comply and be ready to comply with the commitments outlined in the agreement. So perhaps just in the interest of time, I may not ask all panelists to answer that question, but we have another question here in the chat box, so which I will would like to ask Mr. Jerry and also Mr. Teo to briefly answer. So in a nutshell, what is the first step that business should take in order to reap the benefits of RCEP?
Yeah, at least for the SME sector, as mentioned already by most of our panelists, there is a need for us to really catch up with our more advanced counterparts. So there is a need for us to really focus on economic cooperation, especially on capacitating our SMEs. That's why we also support those provisions that were laid out in the SME chapter, because we believe that in order for them to really reap the benefits from this agreement, they have to be competitive. So we really agree also on all those issues raised by the panelists. Thus, there is really a need also for us to ensure or rather focus our interventions on capacitating our respective SMEs in whatever level they may be, but at least as also mentioned by Madam Ina, this is for everybody. It has to be inclusive, so no one will be left out. So there will be an appropriate intervention for every level of our SMEs, wherever they are now. At least there is something for them. So even at the ASME, I understand that will now be the focus of our interventions in the coming years.
Thank you, Mr. Jerry. Mr. Teo?
Yeah, hi Sarah. So I would say that actually for the SMEs and MSMEs, right, if they really like face barriers, especially if let's say they are arising from conduct from big companies, they can actually approach the competition authorities and see whether there's any way out. I think Professor Evelyn just now gave the example of Alibaba. What they do was that they actually impose condition on the merchants that if you list on my platform, you cannot list at the same time on other platforms. I think this is actually very bad, because if you make people choose one or none, that kind of situation, right? Because Alibaba is big. Therefore, most people will definitely choose to list on Alibaba. But actually, if you put yourself as a merchant, you want your product to have the widest reach, and therefore you prefer to be able to list all your products on all available platforms in order to reach as many customers as possible. But if a big player start imposing, like, if you start listing on others, then you cannot list on mine. So most people will gravitate towards the big players, and that is how the whole thing, get saturated until that platform becomes a monopoly. Yeah. So I'm just giving you an example, like, how actually some of these things actually can benefit small businesses. Just to share that for every one complaint that we receive from business saying that, competition law is against them, we receive 10 compliments from other businesses by saying that thank you to competition law that we are able to make access, into the markets, or, we are able to at least, compete with some of the big players, in certain areas.
Thank you, Mr. Teo. Maybe I can also share the question with Professor Evelyn. What's your thought? What should businesses do to reap the benefits of RCEP?
I think the industry community has to be very engaged. Like when we saw in the case of Malaysia, even when we did a study on nutrition labeling, let's say for the food industry, it's just a minute thing of the TBT chapter on labeling, but nutrition labeling was something that went on for 20 over years and they couldn't streamline because some were on Codex, some were not on Codex. So I think the business participation is very, very important to inform the government stakeholders where the problem lies, because even when you do research, you need to corroborate. The ministry will say something, the government will say something, but the businesses will have an entirely different perspective on the issue. So I think the participation of the private sector in reforms, they are very important. So I think the private sector or the business or the industry has to actively engage in all forums where they are invited to give their perspective and ensure that any reforms take into account their perspective and those reforms are beneficial for them. To say it is just RCEP, I mean, they've been having problems on so many issues like SMEs funding gap, unable to comply with NTM, the cost of NTMs, even before RCEP. So the issues have been there and they've been there. They translate even to the point where RCEP is. So I think its private sector engagement is very important in public policy.
Thank you very much. So basically all stakeholders, businesses, governments will have to take part in the implementation of the agreement to make sure that the benefits are fully reaped. So thank you for answering that question. Maybe one final question before we close the session is again to Mr. Teo. We note that the competition chapter contains the first consumer protection provisions that ASEAN has in its FTA. So maybe you would like to elaborate how they protect consumers maybe you would like to elaborate how the RCEP protects consumers through the provisions.
Okay. All right. I think the very straightforward one is really, the consumer protection provisions actually prescribe, conduct, involving, suppliers making false, misleading or deceptive, claims about their products and services. I think it's very, very clear that, it's really to protect consumers so that, suppliers don't actually, in a way, being dishonest or unethical in their business conduct when they claim that, their good or service is something, but actually it turns out to be something else. And usually what happens is that consumers are always at the losing end because there's this thing called about information asymmetry. Most of the time, consumers, they are not involved in the production process. They are not involved in the procurement process. They are only the end consumer receiving the goods and service. So most of the time, producers actually know more. They actually know how the good is made, where the good is from, and what have you. So in the conveying of the information to the consumers, you need to make sure that it's honest, it's ethical. it is a cost-cutting issue with competition, because competition itself is never a subject on its own. Actually, it's cost-cutting. It has implication because businesses, that is when they engage in this kind of thing, right, that you actually make the playing field unlevel, because one way in which you can actually build competition is to lie about your product, claim that your product is actually green, sustainability, in line with the sustainability initiative of governments and what have you. And then you get people who are really, consumers who are really pro the, green action and movement to buy your products. But actually, it's not correct. And then another supplier who are honest probably will suffer as a result. So if you imagine if you don't tackle this kind of thing, right, the whole market will be flooded with people who will start doing the same thing because they realize that being honest, right, actually they lose out. So I think that is why we want to include this provision under competition chapter. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Teo, and thank you so much to all speakers and panelists for providing us some food for thoughts on the RCEP agreement with a specific focus on competition, government procurement, SMEs, and the economic and technical cooperation chapters. Perhaps if I can summarize our discussion. So from the speakers and panelists, we note that the RCEP competition chapter is aimed to promote competition in markets, enhance economic efficiency and consumer welfare. It regulates three main anti-competitive activities, namely anti-competitive agreements, anti-competitive mergers and acquisitions, and abuse of dominant conducts. However, this is to note that collaborations or dominance are allowed, provided it provides net economic benefits. It also provides opportunities for parties to cooperate in the form of notifications of anti-competitive activities and information exchange, among others. On the RCEP SME chapter, it recognizes that MSMEs contribute significantly to economic growth, employment, and innovation, and therefore seek to promote information sharing and cooperation to increase SMEs' ability to utilize and benefit from the opportunities created by the RCEP agreement. It obliges parties to promote sharing by establishing and maintaining a publicly accessible information platform that will contain, among others, regulations and other business-related information pertinent to SMEs. The chapter also aims to strengthen cooperation in the areas of e-commerce, intellectual property rights, market access, access to markets, and innovation. With RCEP, SME can access a huge market within the region, within the RCEP region, with preferential tariffs and clear and transparent simplified procedures. We also take note of the initiatives that have been undertaken by the ASEAN Coordinating Committee on Micro, Small, and Medium Enterprises, which includes the Asean Sme Academy and the ASEAN Access. In terms on the RCEP government procurement chapter, it recognizes contributions of the government procurement to furthering economic integration in the region and to promote growth and employment. The chapter requires parties to publish information on government procurement with the objective of promoting transparency of rules and procedures in government procurement and where tender opportunities are published. The chapter, as we heard, will also help local suppliers to become competitive. And on the fourth chapter area, which is on economic and technical cooperation, it was noted that it aims to minimize duplication of existing efforts and enhance the efficacy and the utilization of resources. It recognizes developments among parties are categorized into developed and developing and least developed countries. And thus the chapter helps to narrow the development gaps amongst these countries and maximize mutual benefits among parties. Under this chapter, the parties agreed to explore and undertake economic and technical cooperation activities with a focus on providing capacity building and technical assistance to developing countries and least developed countries on various areas under the agreement, with a focus on initiatives to increase public awareness and enhance business access to information. There are also potential for businesses to benefit from the technical assistance given under the chapter. And perhaps from the panel discussion today, in terms of how these provisions help to expedite economic recovery following the pandemic, the RCEP agreement takes into account the development gaps, lower trade barriers, and also it also safeguards trade protectionism. And also the panelist stresses the need to ensure ease of doing business in the region. And RCEP upon its enactment creates a conducive business environment, or seeks to create a conducive business environment. It also provides provisions on antitrust laws, as we have heard, to prohibit anti-competitive behavior, and the panelists stress the importance of economic and technical cooperation. In terms of short-term and long-term implications, or the implications of these provisions under the 4 chapters, it was important to the panelists highlighted the importance to streamline regulations and standards at the regional level, and to undertake domestic reforms to fully benefit from high-level provisions in the agreement. SMEs are also encouraged to mainstream sustainable business conduct and environmental considerations in their business processes. We also note that recognizing different levels of development, the negotiations of RCEP has not been an easy undertaking. It is apparent that RCEP is a push and pull agreement, where it becomes a locomotive for countries to establish cooperation in a wide array of areas, as exemplified in the Equitech, SME, and e-commerce chapters. We also note how governments will or should implement the agreed provisions and monitor the implementation and efficacy of the RCEP by needing to focus their priorities on issues that are still lacking domestically, and improve the ease of doing business, and enhance the sharing of knowledge amongst parties. Governments may also consider becoming more digitized, setting up regulations, policies to expedite processes, and to realize the benefits from the agreements. And we also note in this regard, the Equitech chapters facilitate this by tapping technical assistance to reduce compliance cost. And also the panelists and speakers highlighted the importance of the business sector to be engaged to facilitate reforms and highlight the issues encountered. So that more or less sums up our session. Thank you very much to all speakers and panelists for your presentations and interventions. Tiwi, back to you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists for the insightful discussions, and Ms. Sarah Firdaus for moderating the session. So we are now reaching to the end of the webinar. This might be our last webinar in 2021, but definitely not the last RCEP webinar series. We still have 2 more webinars, which are institutional provision and dispute settlements, as well as the special edition webinar as the closer webinar. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. We greatly appreciate your participation. And if you want to rewatch today's webinar, feel free to watch it on ASEAN Secretariat YouTube channel. I'm looking forward to seeing you all in the next webinar. Your host for today, Presti, reminding everyone to keep safe and stay healthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you.